Alright, section 2 in our chapter on the endocrine system is going to see us starting off with different categories of hormones, starting off with the peptide and protein hormones. These would be things like glycoproteins, proteins with carbohydrate groups on them as well. So this first group, as the second group also is going to be, is a hydrophilic group of endocrine hormones. So they are water soluble. They dissolve in water very easily. They're what you call hydrophilic. They dissolve in water. The second category here is going to see the amino acid derivatives. These are hormones that have been produced by modification of various amino acids that result in them becoming hormones. This group is also hydrophilic, so these could be things like catecholamines. Also, the thyroid hormones are amino acid derivatives, as is melatonin. Melatonin is one of those substances that we think is involved with sleep cycles. Although this isn't really completely fully understood, melatonin does play a role in becoming sleepy at a certain point during the day. This one also is an amino acid derivative. And again, both category 1, category 2, peptides and proteins, and the amino acid derivatives, both of those groups are hydrophilic, also called water-soluble hormones. They dissolve very easily in the blood plasma. The third category sees us looking at the steroid hormones, like the sex steroids, corticosteroids, and a few others. These are water insoluble, so they do not dissolve in water. They are hydrophobic. They're based on many times cholesterol, which is basically a type of lipid, so therefore does not dissolve in water very easily. As oil doesn't dissolve in water, this doesn't dissolve in water very easily either. So as we'll see, steroid hormones have to find a slightly different way of getting to their target cells and then accessing their target cells. But in any case, whether they're protein-based, amino acid-based, steroid-based, doesn't matter. In any case, in every case, for them to affect a target cell, that target cell must have a receptor or receptors for that hormone. Now, the lipophilic hormones, like I mentioned, are water insoluble. They're therefore fat soluble. If it doesn't dissolve in water, then typically it does dissolve in fat. We mentioned a few of these before. These, if they're going to be happy in the bloodstream, when I talk about happy, I mean if they're going to travel in the bloodstream without much help, they have to have transport proteins associated with that. If they don't have transport proteins, they are not going to dissolve very well in the blood at all, and it's going to be kind of a mess. So there are transport proteins that allow these hormones to travel in the blood, because remember, these hormones are hydrophobic, they are water insoluble. These proteins are like carriers or escorts to help get these lipid-based hormone molecules to where they need to go. In this case, in the case of lipid-based hormones, the receptors for the cells are actually inside the cells. They are in the cytoplasm of the cells, in some cases in the nucleus of the cells. They're what we describe as being intracellular receptors. They're within the cell, as opposed to the hydrophilic hormones, which have their receptors typically on the outside of a cell. Lipid-based hormones typically act relatively, actually that's going to be a typo, actually, now that I think about it. Let me go ahead and fix that real quick. These are long-lived, and these down here are short-lived. Sorry about that. I hope I didn't confuse anybody with that. Typo there. Okay, so lipid-based hormones typically take a little bit of time before they have their effect. Once they're released into the bloodstream, even once they affect their target cells, it takes a little bit of time before they actually have the effect that you're going to see from that hormone. That being said, once the effect happens, it lasts for a relatively long time. So it takes a while, but once it kicks in, it's also there for a while. On the other hand, the hydrophilic or water-soluble hormones, a lot of the other hormones that we're going to see are water-soluble because they're polar, they're hydrophilic, they're water-soluble, they dissolve in the blood plasma very nicely. Their receptors are going to be on the outsides of cells. And if you think about the cell membranes that we talked about earlier in the semester, cell membranes, remember, are both hydrophilic and hydrophobic. They're hydrophilic on the outer surface, they're hydrophilic on the inner surface, they're hydrophobic on the interior of the membrane. Inside the membrane itself is hydrophobic. So hydrophilic molecules are not able to pass through the phospholipid bilayer to gain entry into the cells. Their receptors need to be on the outsides of the cells. So for protein-based receptors like insulin, for example, insulin has a relatively quick impact on the cells. It's a relatively quick effect once insulin goes into the bloodstream, but it also doesn't last as long. So there's a trade-off here in lipid-based versus water-based hormones in terms of how long it takes them to achieve their mechanism of action, and secondly, how long the mechanism of action actually lasts. But for the hydrophilic hormones, they don't need to have any sort of carrier in the blood because they dissolve very readily in the blood plasma, which is primarily water. All right. So the lipophilic hormones, again, we see things like cortisol or hydrocortisone. We see things like testosterone. We see things like thyroxine. All of those are lipid-based hormones. And all of these have, again, receptors on the insides of the cells. Because they are lipophilic, they're able to cross the primarily lipid-based part of the plasma membrane very, very easily. It takes them a little while to do it, but once they get there, they have kind of a long-term effect. Okay, so all three of these examples are examples of hydrophobic or lipophilic hormones. So again, these are circulating in the blood bound to transport proteins because otherwise they wouldn't get along very well at all with the water in the blood. Once they find their target cells, they're going to dissociate or separate themselves from their carrier proteins. They're going to pass through the cell membrane easily, simple diffusion because they are hydrophobic. The membrane's mostly hydrophobic. They get along very well. The hormone goes right through the cell membrane into the cell where it finds a receptor. And again, that receptor can be free in the cytoplasm or it could be inside the nucleus. Depends on the hormone, depends on the receptor. And at that point in time, there's going to be an effect on gene expression, which is something we haven't talked about in this class a lot. But what the effect basically is here is that once the hormone has its intended effect on the cell, that cell is going to start expressing certain aspects of its DNA. It's going to start manufacturing proteins. It's going to start making things which will then allow it to respond to whatever stimulus initiated the hormone to be released in the first place. So it's all about gene expression, right? DNA being turned into RNA, RNA being turned into protein. This is all affected by the presence of lipophilic hormones at the receptors inside the cytoplasm or inside the nucleus. So this is kind of the effect here for a hydrophobic / lipophilic hormone. The hormone gets to the cell, passes right through the cell membrane very easily because it's hydrophobic, as is the interior part of the membrane. The hormone then gets into a receptor either in the cytoplasm or inside the nucleus. In this case, the receptor is inside the nucleus. This molecule is accepting the hormone. Once that occurs, once you have the hormone at the receptor, there's going to be a change in how DNA is being expressed. So now we see molecule called RNA polymerase, which we're not going to worry about too much, but this is kind of the beginning parts of turning DNA into RNA. So now we have this piece of RNA coming out of the nucleus to a ribosome where it can be translated to make something called protein. And that protein then is then part of the response that the cell has once the hormone actually gets to where it's going. Now for the hydrophilic hormones, these molecules are either really big, really polar, really hydrophilic, really lipophobic, so they don't like going through the interior part of that cell membrane. In this case now, the membrane receptors are going to accept the hormone here on the outside. So now this receptor is poking to the outside here. Hormone comes into it, binds to it, and there's going to be some activator inside of here. This activator is going to serve as a stimulus to some signaling molecule like cyclic AMP, or what's called CAMP here, which then allows for a change in gene expression. It's a much more indirect route to get to where you need to go, but the overall effect here is that once the hormone is in place, we have this signaling molecule like cyclic AMP coming in, activating an enzyme, making some new product eventually, maybe some protein or some other molecule you need to respond. The signaling molecule, the enzyme, the substrate, we talked about substrates and things like that back in our chapter 4, all allow us to make some new product. And that's how the cell is going to respond to the stimulus by releasing that product. All right, next up we have regulation of release. Hormones are typically present in the body, in the blood, in extremely small quantities, and they're extremely powerful. There's also an aspect of negative feedback here, which we remember back from our chapter on overall animal organization and organ systems and those sorts of things. Negative feedback is a stabilizing process where if one hormone is released, we're going to cause a decrease in that hormone once enough effect has been achieved by the presence of that hormone. So for example, when we see antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, right? ADH is secreted by the posterior pituitary in response to a person becoming dehydrated. Some of the effects that it has is that the kidneys will actually recycle more water, and they will release less water into what eventually becomes the urine. Once the body has enough water, once pressure is high enough, once volume is high enough, once osmolarity is within the right range, ADH is then shut off. right? So you don't want to continue to conserve water if you have enough water, because that could actually be disastrous to the body. It could actually cause more harm than good. If you have a high enough blood volume and you continue to conserve water, you could increase blood pressure to the point where organ damage could result. So when you have enough water back in the body, then we're going to shut down ADH, right? So once the body is hydrated, ADH release slows down or stops, and the kidneys go back to functioning normally. Positive feedback, like we've seen before, is much less common. We saw the example of oxytocin with labor and delivery back in that same chapter. Oxytocin is released more and more and more as labor progresses, to the point where eventually it induces contractions strong enough to result in delivery of the baby. All right, the rest of this chapter is on the mammalian endocrine system for the most part. We'll see a couple of little digressions into the world of amphibians here along the way, but for the most part it's about the mammalian endocrine system and some of the forms and features that we have in ours, especially as it relates to particular specific hormones, where they're released, and what effects they have on the body. So we're going to start off looking at the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary together. Okay, so the pituitary gland is actually two glands. Both of them are controlled in some way or another by the hypothalamus. Both of them are influenced by the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus in particular can produce peptide hormones when stimulated, and those peptide hormones will then be released by the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary produces its own hormones and doesn't release them until it gets an indirect signal from the hypothalamus. So again, the hypothalamus controls both anterior and posterior, but in a very, very different way. Right? For the posterior, it makes the hormones released by the posterior directly. For the anterior, it's got to communicate in a more roundabout kind of way. All right. So the pituitary is below the hypothalamus. It's connected to it. There's a bit of a stalk there which connects the hypothalamus to both pituitary glands. And again, the release is under either direct or indirect control, depending on if you're looking at the posterior or anterior pituitary, respectively. So these two pituitary glands, anterior and posterior, but especially the anterior, are especially critical in controlling activities of many, many other systems in the body when it comes to them releasing hormones. As we'll see, the anterior pituitary in particular is often called the master gland because of the range of activities it has on the body. And so just a little bit of an image here showing us the hypothalamus up top here. We have the posterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary, different hormones produced, different mechanisms of control, different textures, different developmental origins. Even though they're adjacent, even though they kind of sort of look similar, they are very, very different in terms of what they are and what they do. All right, so the pituitary gland is sometimes called the hypophysis. It's connected to the hypothalamus, connected to it by a stalk, and there are two parts. The anterior part is called the adenohypophysis, or just anterior pituitary is fine. It's more of a glandular structure. It's not actually technically part of the brain per se, developmentally at least, even though it's connected to it. Developmentally, it's a very, very different sort of an origin. The posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. So it is actually part of the brain. It's more of a fibrous structure. It's not glandular because it's not producing hormones. It's simply releasing the hormones produced by the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus is up here. Got the anterior, got the posterior, different origins, different textures, different functions, different control. The only real similarity they have is where they occur. All right, so for the anterior pituitary gland, there are hormones released from the hypothalamus that will have a control over what and when and the extent to which the anterior pituitary releases its hormones. Releasing hormones are things which tend to increase secretions of the anterior pituitary. So if the hypothalamus produces releasing hormones, that will then stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce and release its own hormones. On the other hand, we also have inhibiting hormones. You have to have both the on and the off switch if this is going to work. So if the hypothalamus produces and releases inhibiting hormones, the anterior pituitary is going to slow down its release of its respective hormones as well. So we have this, again, this idea of antagonism, the push-pull situation where if one is increased, the other is decreased, to help make the mechanism of activity as efficient as possible. And again, the hypothalamus, those hormones that are affecting the anterior pituitary, those hormones that are either inhibiting or releasing, hormone release from the anterior pituitary are delivered to the anterior pituitary by the blood. So it's a very indirect mechanism of control when it comes to how the anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus. Good example here, negative feedback showing you ADH. The stimulus in this case is dehydration. So if your body has lost water, number one, you're going to have a lowered blood volume. And because your blood volume is lower, blood pressure is also going to be lower. Secondly, over here, we're going to have an increased osmotic concentration. So you imagine in your blood, you've got concentrations of all different kinds of things. You've got solutes in there of all different kinds, hormones, nutrients, waste, blood cells themselves, ions floating around, all kinds of stuff hanging out there in the blood. And so if you get rid of water, but don't get rid of solutes, then the relative concentration of the blood is going to go up. So the osmotic concentration increases as dehydration increases. All right, so for this stimulus over here, baroreceptors, or pressure receptors in the aorta, detect a change in blood pressure. Blood pressure drops. The sensory neurons in the aorta are going to detect that change. They're going to send that information off to the integrating center, which happens to be in the hypothalamus here, which is then going to cause the hypothalamus to have some response here in a moment. The osmoreceptors are going to have an effect on sensory cells in the central nervous system. So in the cerebral spinal fluid as well as in the brain, there are chemoreceptors there to detect changes in osmolarity. If like we said, if solute concentration goes up, the brain and spinal cord can detect that. They're going to feed that information also into the hypothalamus, which can then have a response here in a moment, as we'll see it. So now we've got both of these sets of stimuli coming into the hypothalamus. One saying, hey, too much solute. The other one saying, hey, not enough pressure. So the hypothalamus is going to say, all right, we need to produce some ADH. Hypothalamus makes some ADH. The neurohypophysis, remember neurohypophysis is the posterior pituitary, is going to release ADH into the blood, which is going to induce vasoconstriction. So blood vessels, especially arteries and arterioles, are going to get smaller in diameter. Decreased diameter of blood vessels equals increased pressure. So increased pressure is continuously monitored. And so eventually the Bell's baroreceptors we saw before are going to say, okay, now blood pressure is going back up. We must be okay. So it's going to start sending fewer signals back down to the integrating center. On the other hand, over here, ADH also has the effect of reducing urine volume. So even though you still need to produce urine, you still need to get rid of waste, you still need to get rid of solutes, excess ions, and so forth, you're going to send less water with it. Right? So you can either have more concentrated or more diluted urine, depending on how much ADH might be in circulation. If you're dehydrated, you want to lose less water, you want to lose the least amount of water possible. That's going to help reduce urine volume, more water back into the blood, and so because more water is going into the blood and more solutes leaving the body, the osmolarity of the blood is going to go back to where it needs to be. And again, that information is sent back to the hypothalamus continuously so they can monitor the situation as needed. All right, so we're going to cut off here, and I will start up with the next section here momentarily.